Good morning. We're going to be picking up here on the Monitor. What we're going to be doing now is we're going to be implementing SignalR between our Angular CLI application and then also our ASP.NET Web API. So the first thing that I want to do is add my SignalR package here. So on my Web API, we're going to go to Manage NuGet Packages, and what I want to look for is a ASP.NET Core.SignalR. And it's right here. And we're going to go ahead and install it. And add this to the app. Now when we do this, we have to do a couple of different things. The first one is, now that it's installed, if I look at my startup, I need to tell it to use SignalR. So to do that, right here underneath my app use cores policy, I want to add in here use SignalR. Easy enough. And when we do this, we need to pass in our routes, right? And so I need to now define my my route. So we're going to have to make a hub here, and I'm going to call this my web hub. Okay, and so now we need to make a new class in here called hubs, and I'm going to make a new one called web hub. This needs to inherit from hub. And now when I look at this, I should have a couple of overrides in here. I have a public override for on connected and a public override for on disconnected. And in startup now, we also want to tell it to use web hub. Okay. It wants me to use it down here, so endpoints.map SignalR. It's called map hub. And I'm going to map my web hub here to be web hub. Okay. And I think that should be it. So the next thing is that now my web hub is spinning, and we want to make sure that when we log in here in my Angular app that we're connecting to it. So the first thing that I want to do is we need to add in my hub on this side. And that's going to be a new service, which we're going to add in here called Web Hub Service. So in my core module under services, we're going to have an ng generate service called core services. And we're going to call this one the Web Hub. And here it is. So we want to add this into my index. And then into my services module, that looks right. And then here, that looks right. So in my web hub now, I need to add some things. So the first one is that we need to do a npm add, and it's going to be an ASP.NET-SignalR. So if I look at a site here and we do Angular CLI SignalR install. When I add it here, this doesn't have anything with Angular. Just trying to remember, did I just add this to my package.json? I think I did. So what I can do is I can just look at my package.json in here, and we can add in here this ASP.NET SignalR right here, ASP.NET SignalR, and I want to do version 1.1.2. And now when I do an npm update, I should receive it. So now what we can do is we can import that into my class here. So we can do a import everything from SignalR, as SignalR from my ASP.NET SignalR. And we want to say Angular CLI. Now it looks like it's working. Okay, so now we've added that. Come on, there we go. So the next thing that I need to do is I need to define a method in here called connect to hub. And in this, we want to pass in a string here for my hub URL. And so when I do this, I need to send my access token to authorize use. So we're going to add in here my OAuth service called OAuth service. And we're going to first get my access token. And now what I want to do is I need to define something in here called a private hub connection, which is a SignalR.hub connection. So it's going to be a this.hub connection equals a new SignalR.hub connection builder. And we want to pass in the URL for the hub URL. And then we want to concatenate that with a query string, which is going to include my token, which is the access token. And then we don't need any of my logging, like that. And then we're going to build my connection. Now, at this point, we need to subscribe all my hub invoked methods here, right? And so we'll do that in just a second. But the very next thing after we do that is that I want to do a this.hubconnection.start. We also want to have another function called disconnect from hub. And if this .hub connection is something, then we want to stop it. And then we want to destroy it. Okay? That's easy enough, right? Okay, so now what I can do is I can invoke that. So inside of my app component, after we do this ng on init, if it is authenticated, then here I want to do a new bool called private has connected to WebHub, and we're going to say that that's a boolean. So if it has not connected to this WebHub, then we want to tell it that it has. And we're going to pass in my WebHub now. Like that. And I want to say this.webhub.connect to hub. And we're going to connect to my global service dot. And we need to add a new URI here, which is called the Web API URI, which is currently set to this. And then we want to add in here the WebHub suffix. Okay? The other thing that we need to do is we want to have another service here for my OAuth subscription, which I have it. We're going to get the access token, and then we're going to have this same bit of code here. And that should now connect us to SignalR. But we're still not authenticating the user. So let's do an ng-serve. Let's go ahead and run this. And we're going to check to see what happens here. This time it should bring me into my landing page. Whenever it's going to start. What's going on here? Never started? Let's try it again. My connection string it should be going here to my local. Doesn't seem to want to kick through. That's odd. Give it a second here. Now, is this because it's having a hard time mapping SignalR? It might be. So let's go back here into startup and let's get rid of this and try it again. If I was to jump into my SQL server, that looks fine. Should be doing just fine in here. So when I look at my properties on this, we're starting the identity server first. Let's try that. And now we can verify that that's working by going to this well-known that. So that's working. Now we can start up the landing page. So that's working. And then finally we can start up the web hub. It says I need to call add SignalR and configure services. So up here, after cores, I'm going to do services.add_SignalR. What's the difference between these two? We want that one. We'll try it again. Give it a second for everything to start. Didn't mean to hit that button. Making sure that everything starts right, and it does. And then we can click our login. Okay, it's going to want me to log in here. So we can do this. And now you can see that we've successfully connected to the web hub. Logout, cannot find any routes. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is we need to get our authorization on our user. So to do that, that's going to happen inside of my web hub, right? So on connected, we're going to call this new function called a protected virtual, and we can make this larger, asynchronous task called check connection asynchronous. And what we're going to do is we're first going to get my context. like that. And then we're going to get my token from the context. Which we've appended to the query string. So if we've received that query string, what we want to do now is we want to have something for my username and my ASP.NET user ID. And we're going to now use my client here. And what I want to do is I want to get my user information from this. And we're going to do this by doing a client get user info asynchronous. Now this comes from a NuGet package called identity model right here, which we're going to install. And so now what we need to do is have a user info request here that we're going to send across. And to do this, we're going to use my address to be my globals dot. And now we need to have a new URL in here, which is called connect user info. Like that. And then we also want to have my token like that. Now, assuming that that worked okay, I want to do my username now is equal to my user info.claims, and we want to get the ones where the type is equal to name. And we want to get that value. And then my ASP.NET user ID is going to be my user info.claims.toList. And we want to get the first type, which is equal to the sub. Now that we have this, the next thing that I need to do is read the application user. So inside of my code first, I need to have a new domain project, which is a class library. Put it in here. And this is called the monitor.domain.library. And in here, we want to have a new folder called entities. I'm going to make a new class in here, which is called an application user. We also need to have a new entity type called a base entity. Which is a public abstract class. And on it, we want to have a GUID for the ID. And this needs to be a key. And we want to do the database generated. And it's a database generated option.identity, I believe. And then we also want to have a date time called the timestamp, which is equal to datetime.utcnow. Now my application user needs to inherit from base entity. And one of the things that it needs to have on here is an ASP.NET user ID. and the other one is a username. Okay, we need to add in here a new project in the module. Hold on just a second. And I want this to be called it's called the Monitaur dot data access layer. And in this, we need to have one called just a second. Service data access layer. I'm going to add another project in here, and we're going to call this the Monitor.domain.data access layer. Hold on. So we can actually get rid of this. We don't like that. Do I like VS Code? Yes, I use VS Code quite a bit, Captain Roll. How are you doing today? And so in here, I'm going to add a new folder called Services, and I want to add a new service called Base Service, which needs to be a public, and we want to say it's abstract. And I want to add on here a ID, which is a datetime.ut. I'm sorry, it's a GUID.newGUID. So now my service data access layer can inherit my base service. And then we also want to have this as a iBase service. And we want to make this iDisposable. And this needs to inherit iBase service, which means it needs to also have a public virtual void dispose on it. So this is now a base service, and it inherits from iBase service. And so on my service data access layer, we now have a choice, because I could either instantiate this as needed and inject it, or, yeah, let's do that. So we'll make a constructor here, and I want to pass in here an application DB context called context. And when I look at this one, I want to have in here a, what is it called? DB set of application user called application users. Oops. And then we're going to have a protected read-only application DB context called context. Yes, Captain Roll. I've done a lot of similar projects. You can check them out at youtube.pixelhorrorstudios.com. Appreciate that, by the way. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to pop them into the chat. So what I want to have here is I want to first have a public virtual asynchronous task called read application user. I want to pass in here an ASP.NET user ID for this. Who is that? And why isn't that displayed on the screen here? Just a second. Interesting. Thank you for that follow, whoever that was. Let me figure out why that didn't work. Just another second here. We also are going to want to have a public virtual asynchronous task here called read application user, passing in the ID. Yeah, that should have worked. Weird. Okay. So when I get my application user, I'm also going to want to have a public virtual asynchronous task called create application user. And then I'm going to want to have one called a public virtual asynchronous task update application user. And then finally a public virtual asynchronous task called delete application user. So I can now extract my interface and add this on as a I-based service. Okay. So now what I want to do before I write these is inside of my Web API, underneath startup, I'm going to add right here services.addTransient, and it's going to be a I service data access layer to a service data access layer. And so in my Web Hub, I can now inject my I service data access layer called data access layer, protected read-only I service data access layer, data access layer. And we now want to have my dispose, which is a public override dispose. And here I want to do a if my data access layer does not equal to null, then I want to do a dispose on that. And now what I can do is a var, and I need to get my application user. So now my question is, when I do this, do I want to expose this as the view model, or do I want to expose it just as the model? Second. Let's go ahead and create a new module in here. And we're going to add this into my modules folder. And we're going to call this the monitor.lib.internal. Because if you recall, we also had a public project that we created. So I'm going to make a new folder in here called public. And we can add in my existing project. And we don't have any project yet in there. So let me make a new project here. Of a class library. And I'm going to put this in C, companies, projects, the Monitor, public. And this is going to be called the monitor.lib. And now when I do this, I want to save my solution. Right here. Okay? And now I can just add the solution to the project. And now in this class, I'm going to add a new folder called View Models. I'm going to add a new class called DTOs. I'm going to have a, whoops, that was supposed to be a folder called DTOs. I'm going to add a new DTO called a base DTO, which is a public, and it's going to be abstract, and it's only going to have the ID on it. And then we want to have another one called a base view model, which is going to be also abstract. And we want to put on this the ID and the date time for the timestamp. On my data access layer, I'm going to add a new class in here called AutoMap. And on this, we're going to add in my AutoMapper. So in my AutoMap class, we're going to make this a static class. And the only thing I want to have in here is this public static iMapper, which is called createMapper. So when I do this, I'm just going to return a new mapper configuration like that, and it's going to be a builder. I'm sorry, it's a createMapper. And so back in my startup now, we're going to have a services.addSingleton. And it's going to be for an iMapper. And all you want to pass in is automap.createMapper. Okay. So we need to have a new DTO for the application user DTO, which is a base DTO. And then we also need to have one for the application user VM, which is a base VM. And so in the view model, I don't care about the ASP.NET user ID. I only care about the username. So we're going to put that on both of these. And then in AutoMapper, we want to do a c.createMap, and we want to be able to go from application user to application user VM, and then also to the DTO. Okay, we also need to create a new folder in here called requests, and a new folder called responses. And in my lib, we're going to have the same folders here for the internal one called requests and responses. And under request, I'm going to have one called a application user create request. I also want to have one called a create request, public abstract class called create request. And then we're going to have another one for a update request. And the update request is going to have a GUID on this. So my application user create request is a create request. And the only thing we need on this is the ASP.NET user ID and the username. And on the update request, the only thing we need is the username. And then back on the data access layer, we can add in the one for, we want to be able to go from our create request to the application user, and then also from the update request to the application user. Which means that in my data access layer, when we read this, this is now going to return an application user VM. And the delete is going to be a bool. And we're going to pass in here a GUID ID. And then this is a application user update request. And then this is an application user create request. So back in our web hub, we can now get my application user by doing my data access layer dot, and it's a read application user of my ASP.NET user ID. Now, if my application user is null, then what we want to do is create it. And that's going to be a application user equals await data access layer dot create application user, and we're going to pass in this request. And the username as username. And here, otherwise, if my application user dot username dot equals, if it does not equal this, which is the ASP.NET, I'm sorry, it's just username and then ignore case. Then what you want to do is a application user equals await the data access layer dot update it, which is going to be your ID, which is application user dot ID. And here we want to say the username equals username. I came here from Kindred Games hosting you. That's awesome, man. How are you doing, Projectile Chicken? Welcome to the channel. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to put them into the chat. Okay. The next thing I want to do is get my connection ID, right? So to do that, I want to do a var connection equals my await data access layer dot read application user, and we want to add one on here called task read application user connection asynchronous, and all of these need to be marked asynchronous. No problem. If you haven't checked out the YouTube, make sure you check that out at youtube.pixelhorrorstudios.com. Also, we have got a Discord, discord.pixelhorrorstudios.com, so make sure you check all that out. Okay, and this one is going to have a string for the context ID, right, or the connection ID. So when I look at this for my connection, we need to make a new entity for that. And I'm going to call this application user connection. And we want to add that to the code first context here. Like that. And one thing it's going to have is the application user ID on it. And the other thing, and this is going to have a number of connections. Like that. And then on this connection, we want to have a string here for the connection ID. We want to have a bool for my is online, a bool for a has a ping been sent, and that's it. So your connection is only ever going to be used internally. So we're going to make a new library, we want to call this DTOs, and then a new one in here called VMs. And in this, I'm going to call this a application user connection DTO. With these in it. And then we want to have the view model. And remember, the view models have nested data. So with this one, we also want to have the application user DTO called application user. And we want to make this a public class, which is inheriting from my base VM. Okay, over in my, we want to have a new application user connection create request, which is just a connection ID. And then we want to have one for the update request. Like that. And now we want to add that to the auto mapper here. We can actually get rid of this. We don't need that user on there. Okay, so back on the data access layer, we now want to have this task where we read it by the connection ID, by the ID itself. We have a create, which is a application user connection create request. We have an update. And then we have a delete. And the delete just passes in the GUID for the ID. This one returns a bool. And everything else returns a application user connection VM. We also need to have one more, which is a application user ID, which is going to return an iCollection, or we could just say application user connection DTO array. Okay. So back over here, you're going to do a read application user connection of your, and it's the context, which was the context.connection ID. So that's a context.connection ID. Because now what you want to do is you want to say if my connection is equal to null, then you want to do a data access layer dot create application user connection, which is your connection ID. Otherwise, you want to do that your connection equals your update application user connection, where your connection ID equals context.connection ID. Your has a ping been sent is false. Your ID is your connection.id, and your is online is true. And we should be able to make this a cleaner method here. And then you want to do the await base.onConnected asynchronous so that you can connect your client. Finally, you're going to do a client.caller, and you're going to send, it's called a clients.caller.send asynchronous. We're going to say receive the application user, and we're going to pass that application user to the front end. And then we're going to return my connection, because this needs to return a application user connection VM. And otherwise, you want to do a return false. And return a null. And on your connection now, what we want to do is we want to do a await check connection asynchronous. Okay, when you disconnect, we need to do something a little different. We're first going to complete that. Then I want to get my application user. And this needs to be an asynchronous task. Called read application user from your context.connection ID. Up here, you can actually do this like that with the connection ID. So now you can say if my connection does not equal to null, then what I want to do is a try and a catch. And we're going to do a connection equals await my data access layer dot update the connection. And the ping is going to be false. The connection ID is context.connection ID. The ID is the connection.id, and the is online is false. And you'll return. Okay. One thing we still need to add in here is a logger. So if I look at that, the first thing I want to have for a logger is a protected virtual void called getLog. And what we're going to want to do is create a new entity, call this a log API, and then another one called a log error. So in my log API, we want to have a GUID attached to the application user ID. Like that. And this is now going to have a collection of these log APIs and also log errors. Okay. Additionally on here, we're going to want to have the response code, the IP address, and then something we're going to call an endpoint type, which I'm going to put in my library. My internal one, we'll call this a enums. And this is called a endpoint type. And this is going to be a public enum called endpoint type. And we're going to first have a read. We're going to call it a SignalR read application user. We'll call it a connect. And then we'll also have a SignalR disconnect. So in log API, we now want to have an endpoint type. And then a string for the endpoint type value. And in our log errors, we want to do almost the same thing. In this one, we want to have a string. Hold on. Yeah, we want these. We're going to have a string for the exception, and then the IP address again. And so now in my context, I need to have my DB set for log API called log APIs, and then another one for my log error called log errors. So in my web hub, our get log is now going to return a log API, and we want to pass in the endpoint type called endpoint type, and also the GUID for the application user ID. So you're just going to return a new one of these, which is going to have the application user ID, the endpoint type, the endpoint type value, in the IP address. And to get the IP address, you're going to say that you're going to do a try and a catch here. And you're going to set that equal to your context.getHTTP context.connection.remote-address.toString. Okay. You're going to need to have another function in here called a protected virtual asynchronous task of the log error, which is called write log error asynchronous. And then you're also going to want to have one here for the log API called write log asynchronous. And you want to have your HTTP status code here called response code and your log API. So these, we're going to move this into my data access layer. And here we want to also pass in the second. We'll just leave this one where it was. And then this one is a like that. And all you're going to do here is your log.response code is the integer of your response code. And then we want to do the timestamp equals datetime.utc now. And then we're going to do the services, which is the data access layer, dot and then this is a context.logAPIs.add the log. And then you want to say if your await context.saveChanges asynchronous, is greater than 0. Hold on one second. Because that doesn't make the commit in the database at one time. So we can just do this. And then we're going to need to make a new one, which is called a task called int, and it's going to be called commit. And your log error is going to be a log error. And all you're going to do here is at context.logerrors.add your log error. Like that. which means that this is going to be a commit asynchronous, and that your read and your create now is not asynchronous, and your update is. Your create is not. So this needs to return your application user VM. Same thing with this one. And it needs to end with asynchronous. And this needs to be a application user create request. And this needs to now be a GUID ID. So let's go ahead and implement these things. Read, 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 create, create, delete. And there's our commit. And your commit is just going to do this public virtual asynchronous task where we're going to return your await context.save changes asynchronous. Okay, so when we look back at my web hub, we also want to have a protected virtual log API called write log asynchronous, which was going to be a status code and your log API called log. And all you wanted to do was return your, and this is a asynchronous task, await of the data access layer dot this is create log, because it's not currently in the interface, which is a task of the log API called create log, which needs to just pass in your log API. And then there's another one in here called log error, create log error, create log API. So this is now going to be create log of your log. And all you want to do here is say your log.response code is status code and your log.timestamp equals date time.utc now. And this is now just a log API, and it's not asynchronous. And then the other one here is a virtual log error called write log error. And in this one, we want to pass in the morning of Fallen Hope. How are you doing today? If Ray, how are you? Welcome. Yeah, it's because I made the commit separate. So now the log error here is going to be a exception, which is EX, and then a GUID for my application user ID. Because this is just going to do a var log equals new log error. And we're going to pass in here my exception equals ex.message. My application user ID equals that. My IP address is my context.get http context.connection.remote IP address.toString. My endpoint here, we're going to add in here the endpoint type. And then the endpoint type value is toString. And then all we want to do is a data access layer dot create log error and pass in my log error and return that. Now, the thing I don't like is that the timestamps don't match and that you don't have a link to the user. So I'm going to change this, and I'm going to make this to be a log API ID. And then this to be a log API. And the reason I'm doing this is because we want to say that this is a GUID here, which is log error ID. And then this one is a prop log error log error. And this will connect it so that we know what the API point is, and we don't need this either. Installed Hackintosh on my laptop, but it doesn't boot. Well, correction, it panics, but I can't boot off USB. Hey, Blood Barrett, how are you doing this morning? Welcome to the channel. Okay, log error is good. So this means that you want to pass over your log API. And you want to set your timestamp equals to your log API.timestamp. we're going to go ahead and add in here a date time for the timestamp. And I think that that should do it. Now, we could actually just put the timestamp in right here, not modify it, and then assign it to be log API.timestamp. So that'll work. So now when we run our check connection, I want to get my log after I get the user here. I don't like that. So right here, we're going to say the log equals my get log, which is going to be SignalR connected, and it's going to be your application user.id. And then we'll try this again. And then above this, we're going to do a await write log async for my API, which is going to be a OK and the log. And then I want to do an await data access layer dot commit. Like that. And otherwise, what you want to do is here you want to do a write log error, which is going to be your exception and your log API. And then right here, we're going to do the write log API, which is going to be for an internal server error. And then I want to do an await data access layer dot commit asynchronous. Okay? Like that. Like that. Does the if statement matter? Which one are you looking at? Try to create the connection. Create / update the user, the application user's connection. Okay? So let's go ahead and implement now our interface. Which is in here. And I'm going to move it over here so I can look. So when I read my application user, I'm going to do a application user equals await your context dot application users dot first or default asynchronous. And if I look in here, it doesn't have anything aside from the basics. So we can just do the S where my ID is equal to ID and where it is active. So when I look at this active, we want to add a flag on here for active. Oh no, we don't need to do that. We need to add the active flag on base entity. So now what we want to say is if my application user does not equal to null, then we want to return the mapper.map of the application user view model from my application user. And we can change this to be called the entity, and otherwise you want to return null. And now up here we want to have the protected read-only IMapper called mapper. Like that. Okay, and then we can make that a little nicer. This next one, it's going to be nearly exactly the same, except for that we're going to be going for the ASP.NET user ID. One thing I want to add before I forget is on my context, inside of my builder here, my entity for my application user is going to have an index on my ASP.NET user ID, which is unique. We also want to say that my builder.entity of my application user, of my log API we're going to do this from log error. We're going to say has one log API with one log error on delete you want to do a restricted. Okay, back over here. This one's done. This is a create, so it's going to be a entity equals a mapper.map to an application user from the request. And then all you want to do is your context.application users.add your entity, and then return your entity. Your update's a little sticky. Mapper.map to a application user VM your entity. The update, you want to do a var entity equals await your context.application users first or default where your ID is equal to your request.id and it is active. And so now if your entity does not equal to null, then what you want to do is a mapper from your request to your entity. And then you want to say your entity.timestamp equals date_time.now. Entity, and it should be UTC now. And then you want to do a context dot entry of your entity.state equals modified. And you want to return your mapper.map of your application user VM to your entity. Otherwise, you just want to return nothing. Okay, and the last one, the delete. You want to first get your user here. And if your entity does not equal to null, then you want to do a entity.active equals false, a context dot entry of your entity.state equals modified, and then you want to return a true. Okay. The next thing about this is create log API and create log error. Okay, so this one is our connections. So to do this, we want to do this as a virtual asynchronous task, and we're going to get your entities equals a await your context dot connections dot where your s dot application user ID equals application user ID and where it's active. And we want to get the to list of that. And then we want to get our DTOs here as a new list of application user connection DTO. And then for each var entity and entities, I want to do a DTOs.add the mapper.map of my application user connection DTO to my entity. And then here return your DTOs.toArray. Okay, this is the next one here. Real quick before I forget, on my Web Hub, when I look at my disconnect asynchronous, you're going to read it, you're going to update it, hold on. So right here, we're going to do the log equals await, or it's just called get log. And this is SignalR disconnect. And this is going to be my we need to get my var application user equals await data access layer dot get read application user of my context dot connection ID. Okay, and then here you're going to do a log. It's called a write log API of the OK status code. And then you want to say if your, and it's a await your data access layer dot update dot commit is greater than 0, then you want to return. I guess it doesn't matter because we're assuming that it's going to work here. And if that fails, you're going to have the exception in here. And you're going to have a write log error of the exception in your log. And then you want to do a write log API of the internal server error in your log, and do a await data access layer dot commit asynchronous. Okay, over here in my onConnected, if this fails, we're going to return null. Okay, let's go finish these up now. So this one is another read application user. So it's a public virtual asynchronous task. And it's going to be a entity equals await your context dot connections dot, and it's my first or default asynchronous where my ID equals ID and it is active. And if my entity does not equal to null, then we're going to return my mapper.map to my application user connection VM of my entity. Otherwise, you want to return null. And then this will concatenate these things into a conditional. Okay, we're going to do the same thing for the connection ID here. Like that, and then a virtual asynchronous task. Our create is pretty straightforward. We're just going to use this one as our guide. So we're going to map this to an application user connection. We're going to add it to the connections, and then we're going to map it back to the VM. The update, you can use this one. And this is a public virtual asynchronous task. We also wanted to make this one virtual. And this is going to be my application user's connections. Yeah, and then this is a connection VM. And this last one here is a delete. Which is a virtual asynchronous task. This is going to be of connections. Like that. And now this says that I don't have these because they're not public. Okay, let's go ahead and rebuild this now. If it's not nullable and there's an issue, you would throw an exception, commit async. Yeah, I'm okay with having my exceptions percolate up through this services class. They get handled outside of here. The only ones that get handled inside are just writing them. Commit async, if it fails, we want to catch it out here in this try catch or this try catch, and that will fire the next ones. Data access layer will never be null because it's being injected with dependency injection. Okay, so we're ready to test it now. So the next thing I need to do is jump on the Web API. And what I want to do is, underneath my Code First project, I want to make a new add migration for my application DB context, and I want to put my output directory in migrations application. And we're going to call this a init. Just searched ASP.NET and ended up here. Didn't know there were dev tutorials on Twitch. Pretty cool. Hey, how are you doing, Painkiller? Thank you so much. That's awesome. Make sure you check us out on YouTube as well, youtube.pixelhorrorstudios.com. Says that this doesn't have my database context, but it does. So let's go ahead and install this again on Web API. It didn't like that. Let me try it again. Am I running in 3.0 or 3.1? I thought I was in 3.1. I am in 3.1. There we go. Now we can try it again. Okay, it wants me to configure the foreign key property between these two entities. Okay, so let's go up and look over here at the child dependent side could not be determined for one-to-one entity framework core. Okay, so it wants me just to add this has a foreign key property. So over in the database context, we can add this has foreign key, which is a hold on. Okay, so they're changing the names on this. So it's the other one. So this is going to be a log API. And your author ref that's your foreign key. That one. Let's try it again. Okay, that time it took. We can do the update database on that now. Give it a second to update our database. Okay, we can now run our multiple projects. And this time, when we log in, it should kick me right back to auth into the identity server, and it did. Here we are, we're checking our connection, everything injected correctly. So we're stepping through, we've received our token. We're going to get my user info. It's okay, we got that. We get my claims for my name and my ID. We're going to read my user. It's not there, so we create it. We make the log. We create the connection. This actually needs to get changed where that one is at. And now this is saying that an error occurred. Interesting. Because it didn't know that it created. Okay, so we need to move this down here. And then it's not aware of the transactional data. So when we're doing my create request, I want this to include a GUID for my application user ID. So that way, oh yeah, see, that was the problem. It didn't have the application user ID. Have you done a simple CRUD application with Angular? I'm currently learning Angular, but this is a bit too advanced for me. Are you in California? We have the same time zone. I am in California. Yeah, go here to youtube.com. Give it a second to load. Where are you at in California, if I may ask? I'm in Ventura. I hate that that thing takes forever to spin. I wonder if the application pool is set to go away. But it should just be a redirect, so it's weird. Yeah, there's this one. And then there's this one. You beat me to it. Okay, so this time when I log in, and it boots me in, I guess I wasn't watching this when it disconnected and connected, so let's go back to the Web Hub. It looks like it worked though, and if I were to run it again, this time we connect, we get the token, we check the user info point, it works, we get our application user, it does equal that, we get our connection, which is null, so we create the connection. We write the log, we commit it, we save it, and we return. So that's it. Now we are hooked up with SignalR with error logging on this. So let me go ahead and make a commit on this, which we're going to say is a new commit. We're going to say implemented SignalR for data transfer layer between the Web API and the Angular CLI Web Application. No problem, Painkiller. Are you a part of our Discord as well? That's a great technical resource if you haven't checked it out. That's at discord.pixelhorrorstudios.com. All right. So the next step that we're working on, let me actually pull up my design document. So if you look at the design that we initially created for it, we've created our identity server. We have it hooked up to SQL Server. We have it with our user services, I believe, for register password forgot and username forgot. We have our login set up through our web application, and that also is done through our static site. We have a resource server set up with our database and our user accounts. We still need to create our persistent connection service here. And then finally, we need to create our plugins down here. And then we just have to finish filling in the app. So I think the next thing that we're going to do is implement SignalR to be this layer here. And then additionally, we're going to have another layer for statuses when we get to this plugin. So thank you for staying with me for now. We're going to take a short break. I'll be back in, I don't know, 15 minutes. When we get back, we'll continue with where we're going. And then make sure you check us out, discord.pixelhorrorstudios.com. And I put all these videos up at youtube.pixelhorrorstudios.com. See you guys in just a little bit. Thanks again.